Moscow, in the 16th century, was a city of wood, bells, and ice. Wooden palaces clustered within the Kremlin walls, their carved gables dark against winter skies. Wooden churches crowned with onion domes rose above wooden houses that lined unpaved streets. The whole city, a forest reassembled into human habitation. In winter, snow muffled everything: the creak of sledges, the shouts of merchants, the endless tolling of bells that marked the hours and called the faithful to prayer. Fire was the constant terror. Flames could devour entire districts in hours, and did so regularly. Into this world of beauty and fragility, of gold icons and frozen rivers, a prince was born who would transform Russia and drench it in blood. Ivan Vasilievich entered the world on August 25th, 1530, the long-awaited heir to the throne of Muscovy. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, had divorced his first wife after 20 years of childless marriage and taken a young Lithuanian noblewoman, Elena Glinskaya, specifically to produce an heir. The dynasty demanded continuation. The Rurikid line that had ruled Russian lands for 7 centuries could not be permitted to die. When Elena finally delivered a son, the relief was immense, and the boy's importance was established before he drew his first breath. He would have almost no time to know his father. Vasily III died in December 1533, when Ivan was 3 years old. The Grand Prince had developed an abscess on his leg that turned to gangrene, and no treatment available to 16th century medicine could save him. On his deathbed, Vasily appointed a regency council to govern until Ivan came of age and entrusted his young wife with their son's protection. Then he was gone, leaving a toddler as the nominal ruler of a realm surrounded by enemies and divided by factions. Elena Glinskaya proved more capable than anyone had expected. For 5 years, she governed as regent with genuine authority, implementing reforms that would outlast her brief rule. She standardized the Russian currency, replacing the chaos of regional coinages with a unified monetary system. She strengthened fortifications along vulnerable borders, particularly against the Crimean Tatars whose raids terrorized the southern frontier. She managed the boyars, the hereditary nobility whose great families had served the throne for generations, but who never stopped scheming to increase their own power at the crown's expense. The boyars watched, waited, and plotted. Elena was a foreigner, a Lithuanian, a woman ruling in a world that expected women to remain secluded in the harem. Her power depended entirely on her son's survival and her own ability to maintain control. When that ability faltered, nothing would protect her. In April 1538, Elena Glinskaya died suddenly. Ivan was 7 years old. The official cause was illness, but poison was suspected immediately and has been suspected ever since. Modern forensic analysis of her remains has revealed elevated levels of mercury, suggesting that the suspicions were justified. Someone, most likely one of the boyar factions, had murdered the regent and left her son defenseless. What followed scarred Ivan for life. The boyar families descended on power like wolves on wounded prey. The Shuyskis and the Belskis, 2 great clans with ancient lineages and ruthless ambitions, fought for control of the regency and, through it, control of Russia. The child Grand Prince became a pawn in their struggles, nominally ruling while real authority passed to whoever had most recently seized it. Coups and counter-coups followed in rapid succession. Men who held power 1 month found themselves imprisoned or dead the next. The court became a theater of conspiracy, where no one could be trusted and everyone was afraid. Ivan watched it all. He was too young to participate and too important to ignore. So he existed in a peculiar limbo, theoretically supreme, practically helpless. The boyars who controlled him showed him just enough deference to maintain appearances, while denying him any real agency. They used him as a prop for their legitimacy, trotting him out for ceremonies and foreign ambassadors, then returning him to neglect the moment formal occasions ended. Later, Ivan would describe his childhood in terms that still disturb readers after 5 centuries. In letters to his former friend, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, he recalled being denied food and clothing, left to wander the palace in rags while the boyars feasted. He remembered the Schwiskis bursting into his chambers, sprawling on his dead father's bed with their boots on, treating him with contempt that barely bothered to disguise itself. He remembered favorites, people who had shown him kindness, being dragged away and killed while he stood helpless. How much of this was literally true, and how much was exaggeration shaped by later bitterness, historians cannot determine with certainty. What is clear is that Ivan experienced his childhood as a time of trauma, powerlessness, and fear. He learned that power was the only protection against those who would destroy you. He learned that enemies surrounded him always, wearing the faces of friends and servants. He learned that trust was weakness and mercy was invitation to betrayal. One figure offered something different. Metropolitan Macarius, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, took an interest in the young Grand Prince that went beyond political calculation. He educated Ivan, introducing him to religious texts, Russian chronicles, and Byzantine political theory. He planted in the boy's mind the idea that a ruler was not merely a political figure, but a divinely appointed sovereign responsible to God for his realm, wielding authority that came from heaven itself. The concept of sacred autocracy, absolute power justified by divine mandate, took root in Ivan's consciousness during these years. Nurtured by a churchman who saw in the neglected prince the potential for something greater than his tormentors could imagine. Ivan was also intelligent, fiercely so, with a memory that retained everything he read, and a capacity for argument that would later astonish foreign ambassadors and terrify his own subjects. He devoured books, interrogated scholars, and developed theological opinions that he would defend with quotations and citations until his dying day. The education Macarius provided gave Ivan intellectual weapons to match the political instincts his brutal childhood had honed. By his early teens, Ivan had begun to assert himself. The first clear sign came in 1543, when he was 13 years old. Andrei Schwiski, the dominant figure among the boyar regents, had grown careless in his treatment of the young Grand Prince. Ivan had endured years of humiliation from the Schwiskis, and something, perhaps a specific insult, perhaps simply accumulated rage, finally broke his patience. He ordered Andrei Schwiski seized and handed over to his kennel keepers, the men who tended the royal hunting dogs. They beat Schwiski to death. Whether on Ivan's explicit orders or through excessive zeal, no one recorded. The message was unmistakable. The child who had been pushed around for a decade was no longer willing to be pushed. The surviving boyars took note. The balance of power began, slowly, to shift. Over the next few years, Ivan consolidated his position through a combination of strategic violence and careful alliance building. He executed or exiled those who had tormented him most openly, while cultivating relationships with families willing to support his personal rule. Metropolitan Macarius remained his closest advisor, reinforcing the ideology of sacred autocracy and preparing for a ceremony that would announce Ivan's emergence as a ruler unlike any Russia had known. By late 1546, Ivan was 16 years old enough, by the standards of his time, to rule in his own right. He had survived a childhood that killed or broke so many princes, emerging not unscathed but functional, his wounds transformed into weapons. The fearful boy who had watched helplessly as enemies controlled his world, had become a young man determined to ensure that he would never be helpless again. He would not merely continue the work of his ancestors, he would surpass them. He would not be Grand Prince of Moscow, a title that placed him among other princes and implied limits on his authority. He would be something new, something that announced to Russia and the world that a different kind of power had emerged from the Kremlin's wooden walls. He would be Tsar. On January 16th, 1547, Ivan Vasilievich walked into the Cathedral of the Dormition in the heart of the Kremlin and emerged as something Russia had never seen. The cathedral blazed with candlelight reflecting off golden icons. Incense hung thick in the air, mingling with the chanting of priests whose voices rose and fell in ancient liturgies. The boyars stood in their heavy robes, watching the ceremony they could not prevent, their faces masks of careful neutrality. Metropolitan Macarius presided, his years of preparation reaching their culmination in this single morning. Ivan knelt before the altar, and Macarius placed upon his head the cap of monarch, a golden crown trimmed with sable fur, studded with gems, supposedly inherited from the Byzantine emperors through the princes of Kievan Rus. The cap represented a claim that reached back centuries and forward into eternity, that the ruler of Moscow was heir to Rome itself, to the Christian empire that had guarded the true faith since Constantine. When Ivan rose, he bore a title no Russian ruler had formally claimed before: Tsar, Caesar, Emperor. The title was not mere vanity. By crowning himself Tsar of all Rus, Ivan announced that he stood above the boyars who had tormented his childhood, above the princes who ruled other Russian lands, above everyone except God himself. The grand princes of Moscow had been first among equals, powerful lords among other lords. The Tsar was something categorically different, an autocrat whose authority derived from heaven, whose word was law, whose subjects existed to serve his will. The ideology Macarius had taught now had a name and a crown to match. 3 weeks later, Ivan married. His bride was Anastasia Romanovna, daughter of a noble but not particularly prominent family, selected through a process that had gathered eligible young women from across Russia for the Tsar's inspection. She was beautiful, by all accounts, and gentle, qualities that would matter more than anyone could have predicted. What drew Ivan to her beyond these attributes, whether genuine affection or political calculation or simple chance, the sources do not reveal. What they do reveal is that she became the closest thing to a stabilizing influence that Ivan would ever know. Anastasia softened him. Contemporary accounts describe the young Tsar in these early years as pious, eager to rule justly, genuinely concerned with the welfare of his people. Whether this represented his true nature finally able to emerge, or whether Anastasia's presence simply calmed the storms that raged within him, the effect was real. For 13 years, while she lived, Ivan governed with a restraint that would seem unimaginable once she was gone. He also governed with help. Around the young Tsar gathered a group of advisors who would guide the early reforms of his reign, the so-called Chosen Council, though that name came later. 2 figures dominated: Alexei Adashev, a minor noble of exceptional administrative ability who became Ivan's closest secular advisor, and the priest Sylvester, a stern moralist who reinforced the religious dimensions of Ivan's self-image. Together with Metropolitan Macarius, they formed a brain trust that channeled Ivan's intelligence and ambition into constructive governance. The reforms they implemented transformed Russia. In 1550, Ivan promulgated a new law code, the Sudebnik, that standardized judicial procedures, limited the abuses of local officials, and began the long process of creating a unified legal system for the sprawling realm. The following year, the Stoglav Council addressed the church, reforming religious practices, standardizing rituals, and tightening ecclesiastical discipline. Administrative reorganization reduced the power of hereditary governors in favor of officials appointed by and accountable to the crown. The army was restructured with new units of streltsy, musketeers, forming the core of a more professional military force. These were not the actions of a madman. The Ivan of the early reign was ambitious, certainly, and ruthless when he judged ruthlessness necessary. But he was also capable of listening to advice, of tempering impulse with calculation, of building rather than merely destroying. The boy who had survived the chaos of his childhood seemed to have emerged as a ruler genuinely committed to imposing order on a realm that desperately needed it. Then Moscow burned. In June 1547, just months after Ivan's coronation, fire swept through the wooden capital with devastating fury. The blaze started near the Arbat and spread with a speed that no one could check, leaping from roof to roof, consuming entire districts before exhausting itself. Thousands died. Tens of thousands lost their homes. The Kremlin itself was damaged, its wooden structures reduced to ash, while stone walls cracked from the heat. The city that had witnessed Ivan's triumph now lay in smoking ruins. The people, traumatized and furious, sought someone to blame. Rumors spread that witchcraft had caused the fire, that enemies of the Tsar had used dark magic to destroy the capital. Suspicion fell on Ivan's maternal relatives, the Glinskys, who had accumulated power and resentment in equal measure. A mob descended on the Glinsky residences, murdered Ivan's uncle Yuri, and then marched on the village where Ivan himself had taken refuge, demanding that he surrender his grandmother to their justice. Ivan faced the crowd and did not flinch. By some accounts, he spoke to them directly, acknowledging the disaster, promising to rebuild, channeling their rage into something he could manage. By other accounts, he simply waited until the mob's fury exhausted itself, then quietly ordered the ringleaders arrested and executed. Either way, he survived, and he learned the people could become a weapon, their anger directed at his enemies or at himself, depending on how skillfully he managed their grievances. Power that seemed absolute could vanish in hours if a ruler lost control of the story his subjects believed. The fire and its aftermath marked a transition. Ivan threw himself into reconstruction, rebuilding Moscow with energy that impressed even those who distrusted him. But something had shifted. The vulnerability he had felt as a child, watching helplessly while others controlled his fate, had returned in new form. He had nearly been torn apart by the same people he was anointed to rule. He would not forget how quickly everything could collapse, how thin the line was between Tsar and victim. For now, though, he channeled his energies outward. To the east lay the Khanate of Kazan, a Tatar state that had raided Russian lands for generations, carrying off thousands of captives into slavery, blocking the trade routes that connected Russia to Asia. Previous campaigns against Kazan had failed, the fortress city defying every attempt to conquer it. Ivan determined to succeed where his ancestors had not. In 1552, after years of preparation and 2 unsuccessful preliminary campaigns, Ivan led his army against Kazan in person. The siege was brutal, lasting weeks through the late summer and into autumn. Russian engineers tunneled beneath the walls, packing the passages with gunpowder. On October 2nd, the mines exploded, breaching the fortifications and sending Russian troops pouring into the city. The fighting that followed was savage, street by street, house by house. but by nightfall, Kazan had fallen. Ivan entered the conquered city as a triumphant Christian emperor, claiming to have liberated Orthodox lands from Muslim domination. The reality was more complex. Kazan's population was diverse, and Russian motives were as economic as they were religious, but the narrative served its purpose. The young Tsar, who had nearly been destroyed by a Moscow mob, had conquered a Khanate. The ruler who had been helpless as a child now commanded armies that reshaped the map. He returned to Moscow in glory, and Anastasia greeted him with news that completed his triumph. She was pregnant again, and soon she would bear him an heir. The dynasty would continue. The future seemed bright. Ivan was 22 years old. He had survived a childhood of trauma, claimed a title of unprecedented authority, weathered fire and uprising, and conquered an ancient enemy. The darkness that would define his later reign had not yet emerged, or rather, it remained hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the circumstances that would call it forth. Those circumstances would come soon enough. The illness struck without warning. In March 1553, Ivan collapsed with a fever so severe that his physicians believed he would die. For days he lay delirious, slipping in and out of consciousness, while the court dissolved into barely concealed panic. The Tsar was 22 years old, and his heir was an infant, the Tsarevich Dmitri, barely a few months old, incapable of ruling, and certain to become a pawn in exactly the kind of boyar power struggles that had tormented Ivan's own childhood. Ivan summoned his nobles to swear allegiance to his son. What followed revealed how shallow his authority truly was. The boyars hesitated, some refused outright, others hedged with conditions and qualifications. A faction formed around Ivan's cousin, Vladimir of Staritsa, arguing that a grown prince would serve Russia better than an infant Tsar. The men who had bowed and scraped before Ivan for 6 years now showed their true calculations. They had obeyed him because he was strong, and the moment he appeared weak, their obedience evaporated. Even members of the chosen council wavered, weighing their options, protecting their positions. Ivan recovered. He noted carefully who had been loyal and who had not. The names of those who hesitated went into a memory that forgot nothing and forgave less. The illness passed, but the lesson remained. The boyars would betray him the instant they saw advantage in betrayal. Only fear greater than any calculation of profit, could keep them in line. For now, he channeled his energy into conquest. The fall of Kazan had opened the Volga River to Russian control, but the Khanate of Astrakhan still commanded the river's southern reaches, where it emptied into the Caspian Sea. In 1556, Russian forces swept down the Volga and took Astrakhan with minimal resistance, the Khanate's defenders scattering before an army flushed with confidence from its earlier victory. The entire length of the great river now belonged to Moscow. The conquests transformed Russia's position. Control of the Volga meant control of trade routes connecting the Baltic to Persia, furs and timber flowing south while silk and spices flowed north. New fortresses rose along the riverbanks, anchoring Russian authority over territories that had never known Muscovite rule. Towns were founded, settlers dispatched, churches built to consecrate the newly Christian lands. The realm that Ivan's grandfather had governed was perhaps 1.5 million square kilometers. The realm Ivan now controlled had more than doubled in size. In Moscow, he commissioned a monument to his victories. The Cathedral of the Intercession of the Most Holy Theotokos, known ever after as St. Basil's Cathedral, rose on Red Square in a riot of colour and form that defied every convention of Russian architecture. Its 9 chapels, each crowned with a distinctive onion dome, painted in swirling patterns of red and gold and green, celebrated the stages of the Kazan campaign. The building was unlike anything Russia had seen. A declaration in stone and brick that the new Tsar would not be bound by the limits of the past. Legend claimed that Ivan had the architects blinded so they could never create anything to rival it, almost certainly false, but revealing of how later generations understood his character. Cultural ambitions matched territorial ones. Ivan established Russia's first printing press, bringing the technology that had transformed Western Europe to Moscow's wooden streets. Books of religious instruction rolled off the press, standardizing doctrine and spreading literacy beyond the monasteries where it had previously been confined. Scholars gathered at court, translating texts, compiling chronicles, creating the documentary record that would allow future generations to know what Ivan had achieved. In 1558, Ivan turned his attention westward. The Livonian Confederation, a loose collection of German-speaking territories along the Baltic coast, remnants of the crusading orders that had once terrorized the region, seemed ripe for conquest. Its internal divisions made it vulnerable, and its ports offered something Russia desperately needed: direct access to Western European trade and technology, without the intermediaries who currently extracted profits from every transaction. Ivan launched the Livonian War with expectations of quick victory. He was wrong. The war that began in 1558 would drag on for 25 years, drawing in Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark, draining Russian resources and ultimately ending in defeat. But those consequences lay in the future. In the early campaigns, Russian forces advanced rapidly, capturing fortresses and towns, and Ivan had every reason to believe that success would continue. Then Anastasia died. She had been ill for some time, her health declining through the spring and summer of 1560. On August 7th, she was gone. Ivan's grief was volcanic. Witnesses described him throwing himself against walls, tearing at his hair, wailing with an abandon that shocked the court. 13 years of marriage had produced 6 children, though only 2 sons survived. More than that, 13 years of her presence had provided the only stability Ivan had known since childhood. Whatever peace existed within him had been bound up with her, and now that binding was severed, Ivan believed she had been murdered. He became convinced that Boyars had poisoned Anastasia, just as Boyars had poisoned his mother decades before. Modern analysis of her remains has indeed revealed elevated levels of mercury, though whether this indicates poisoning or merely the toxic medical treatments of the era, no one can say with certainty. What matters is that Ivan was certain. The enemies who had tormented his childhood, who had wavered during his illness, who surrounded him still behind their masks of loyalty, they had taken from him the one person who made his life bearable. The transformation that followed was not instantaneous, but it was profound. The Ivan who emerged from Anastasia's death was harder, more suspicious, quicker to see conspiracy in every shadow. Adashev and Sylvester, the advisors who had guided his early reign, fell from favor within months, accused of failing to protect the Tsarina, of complicity in imagined plots, of the 1,000 offenses that a paranoid mind can manufacture from innocent actions. Adashev died in prison. Sylvester was exiled to a distant monastery. The chosen council that had tempered Ivan's impulses was dissolved. Prince Andrei Kurbsky, one of Ivan's most capable military commanders, watched these developments with growing alarm. In 1564, while commanding forces in the Livonian War, he made a decision that would haunt Russian political thought for centuries. He defected to Lithuania, abandoning his Tsar to serve the enemy. From exile, Kurbsky wrote to Ivan, denouncing his tyranny and defending his own flight as the only honorable response to unjust persecution. Ivan wrote back, and the correspondence that followed became one of the most remarkable documents in Russian history. The Tsar poured out his grievances, his theology, his vision of autocratic power, his rage at those who dared question his authority. Kurbsky responded with arguments about the limits of kingship, the rights of nobles, the duties that bound rulers as well as subjects. Two visions of Russia clashed in letters, carried by secret messengers across hostile borders. Ivan won the argument, at least in practice. The autocracy he embodied would survive and strengthen over the centuries, while the aristocratic constitutionalism Kurbsky championed would remain a path not taken. But the exchange revealed how far Ivan had travelled from the promising young reformer of 1547. The Tsar, who had once listened to advisers, now demanded absolute submission. The ruler who had built institutions now trusted only his own judgment. Confidence had curdled into something darker, and the worst was yet to come. In December 1564, the people of Moscow witnessed something unprecedented. Their Tsar was leaving. Ivan had spent weeks preparing in secret, loading wagons with treasury gold, icons, jewels, and the regalia of state. When the convoy finally departed, it stretched for miles. Hundreds of sledges carrying not just wealth, but the apparatus of government itself. The Tsar offered no explanation. He simply left, taking his family and his closest servants, abandoning the capital to confusion and fear. He travelled north to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, a fortified estate that would become his refuge and his headquarters for the terror to come. There he remained through the frozen weeks of January, silent, unreachable, while Moscow spiraled into panic. The boyars gathered in the Kremlin, debating what to do, wondering if they had finally pushed their sovereign too far, uncertain whether this was abdication or threat, or the prelude to something worse. Then the letters arrived. Ivan sent 2 messages to Moscow, carefully designed to divide his subjects against each other. The first, addressed to the Metropolitan and the boyars, was an indictment. It catalogued every grievance Ivan had accumulated over 34 years, the humiliations of his childhood, the treasons of the nobility, the failures of his advisers, the endless conspiracies that had surrounded him since infancy. The boyars had betrayed him, stolen from him, murdered his beloved Anastasia, and left him no choice but to abandon the throne he could no longer occupy with honor. He was done with them all. The second letter went to the common people of Moscow. It assured them that the Tsar bore them no anger, that his quarrel was with the treacherous nobles who had made governance impossible, that his subjects remained dear to him even as their lords had proven false. The message was calculated to perfection. Ivan positioned himself as the people's protector against aristocratic oppression, inviting them to see the boyars as their enemies too. The strategy worked. Crowds gathered in the streets demanding that the Tsar return. Delegations of merchants, clergy, and common citizens traveled to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, begging Ivan to resume his throne. The boyars, isolated and terrified of popular fury, had no choice but to join the pleas. They sent their own representatives, offering whatever terms Ivan demanded, promising whatever submission he required. Ivan received them graciously and named his price. He would return to Moscow, but under conditions that fundamentally altered the nature of Russian government. He demanded the right to punish traitors as he saw fit, without interference from church or nobility. He demanded control over certain territories that would be separated from the rest of Russia and governed according to his will alone. He demanded, in effect, absolute power, unchecked by any institution or tradition that had previously constrained the throne. The boyars accepted. They had no alternative. In February 1565, Ivan returned to Moscow, but the man who returned was barely recognizable. Observers noted that he had aged dramatically in just 2 months. His hair and beard gone grey, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with an intensity that unsettled everyone who met them. Whatever internal transformation had occurred during his retreat, it had left visible marks. He announced the creation of the Oprichnina. The word derived from oprich, meaning apart or separate. Ivan divided Russia into 2 realms, the Zemshchina, the land, which would continue under traditional administration, and the Oprichnina, territories carved out for the Tsar's personal rule, governed by men answerable only to him. The Oprichnina lands included some of the wealthiest regions of Russia, strategic towns, profitable trade routes, estates confiscated from boyars Ivan deemed disloyal. The nobles who lost their ancestral lands were forcibly resettled to distant territories, their wealth stripped, their status destroyed. To enforce his will, Ivan created a new force, the Oprichniki. These men, eventually numbering perhaps 6,000, dressed in black, rode black horses, and carried symbols that announced their mission with chilling clarity. From their saddles hung a dog's head, representing their duty to sniff out treason, and a broom representing their task of sweeping treachery from the land. They swore oaths of absolute loyalty to Ivan personally, renouncing all other ties of family, friendship, or obligation. They became a state within a state, a private army, serving a Tsar who increasingly saw himself as the only reliable judge of loyalty and guilt. The Oprichniki answered to no law but Ivan's command. They could arrest anyone, seize any property, execute any sentence their master decreed. Boyars who had dominated Russian politics for generations found themselves dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, their fates decided in secret tribunals where accusation was equivalent to conviction. Some were executed publicly, their deaths staged as spectacles of terror. Others simply vanished, their names erased, their families left to wonder what had become of them. Court life transformed into a nightmare of suspicion and performance. Nobles learned to watch every word, every gesture, every association that might be reported to the Oprichniki. Old friendships became liabilities. A connection to someone who fell from favor could drag down everyone in their circle. Men denounced rivals, neighbors, even relatives, hoping to prove their loyalty by identifying new traitors. The atmosphere of paranoia that Ivan had experienced as a child now engulfed the entire ruling class. Ivan presided over this terror with a strange mixture of cruelty and piety. At Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, which became his preferred residence, he organized his household as a mock monastery. The Oprichniki wore black robes like monks. They observed regular hours of prayer, with Ivan himself leading services, ringing the bells for matins at 4 in the morning. Between prayers, they conducted interrogations and executions. The Tsar seemed to see no contradiction. He was doing God's work, purging the realm of traitors, and the blood he spilled was sanctified by divine purpose. The terror had a political logic, however deranged its methods. Ivan was systematically destroying the power of the hereditary nobility that had threatened his childhood, humiliated his early reign, and wavered during his illness. The old boyar families who had treated the throne as a prize to be manipulated found themselves broken, their lands redistributed to men whose loyalty depended entirely on Ivan's favor. A new service nobility emerged, owing everything to the Tsar, and therefore bound to him absolutely. The aristocratic constitutionalism that Kurbsky had championed was being drowned in blood. But terror, once unleashed, develops its own momentum. The Oprichniki needed to justify their existence by finding ever more traitors. The circle of suspicion widened from genuine rivals to imagined enemies to anyone whose destruction might please the Tsar or profit his servants. Russia was consuming itself, and even seemed either unable or unwilling to stop. The darkness that had always lurked within him had finally been given form. Black-robed riders on black horses, carrying dogs' heads through the frozen streets of a terrified nation. The terror found its voice in Metropolitan Philip. Philip Kolichev had been appointed head of the Russian Church in 1566, chosen by Ivan himself to replace a more pliable predecessor. It was a miscalculation. Philip came from an old boyar family, and he possessed something rare in Ivan's Russia: the courage to speak truth to power. He watched the Oprichniki's depredations with growing horror, and in 1568 he did what no one else dared. He confronted the Tsar publicly. During a service in the Dormition Cathedral, with the court assembled and Ivan present in his black Oprichnik robes, Philip refused to give the Tsar his blessing. Instead, he denounced the terror, calling on Ivan to abolish the Oprichnina and cease the shedding of innocent blood. "We are offering here a pure and bloodless sacrifice for the salvation of men," Philip declared. "But outside this temple, the blood of Christians is being spilled and people are being killed." Ivan listened in silence, then walked out. Within months, Philip was arrested on fabricated charges, defrocked in a humiliating ceremony where Oprichniki tore the vestments from his body and imprisoned in a distant monastery. The following year, as Ivan's forces marched toward Novgorod, the Tsar sent his most savage lieutenant, Malyuta Skuratov, to deal with the former metropolitan. Philip was strangled in his cell, his death officially attributed to the excessive heat of his quarters. The church had challenged the Tsar's power, and the church had lost. The road to Novgorod was paved with paranoia. Ivan had become convinced that the ancient city, proud, wealthy, historically resistant to Moscow's authority, was plotting to defect to Lithuania. Whether any such conspiracy actually existed remains unclear. The evidence was thin, even by the standards of Ivan's tribunals, but the Tsar saw treason everywhere, and Novgorod's history of independence made it a plausible target for his suspicions. In January 1570, the Oprichniki descended on the city. What followed was not warfare, but systematic destruction. The Oprichniki sealed Novgorod off, preventing escape, then worked through the population with methodical cruelty. Nobles were arrested and tortured until they confessed to whatever crimes their interrogators suggested. Merchants were stripped of their wealth. Common people were driven onto the frozen Volkhov River, where holes had been cut in the ice and pushed beneath the surface to drown. For weeks the killing continued, until the river itself seemed to flow with bodies. Estimates of the dead vary wildly, from a few thousand to tens of thousands, but the exact number matters less than the totality of the devastation. Novgorod, one of Russia's oldest and most important cities, was gutted. Its economy was ruined, its population decimated, its spirit broken. Ivan attended banquets in the Archbishop's palace while his men slaughtered townspeople outside. The city that had once rivaled Moscow was reduced to a husk, a warning to any community that might imagine itself beyond the Tsar's reach. Ivan moved on to Pskov, apparently intending similar treatment, but something stopped him. A holy fool who dared to confront him, or perhaps simply the exhaustion of even his appetite for blood. Pskov was spared the worst, though it too suffered. The Tsar returned to Moscow, leaving behind frozen corpses and traumatized survivors. The Oprichnina had achieved its goal of destroying the old boyar elite, but it had also crippled Russia itself. The very nobles who might have administered provinces, commanded armies, and collected taxes had been killed, exiled, or reduced to terrified paralysis. The systematic terror that was supposed to strengthen the state had hollowed it out. The consequences became clear in 1571, when Russia's external enemies tested its weakness. The Crimean Tatars, vassals of the Ottoman Empire, had raided Russian lands for generations. Now, sensing opportunity, Khan Devlet-Giray assembled an army far larger than usual and struck north. The Russian forces that should have stopped him, weakened by purges, demoralized by terror, poorly coordinated, failed to mount effective resistance. The Tatars swept past defensive lines and reached Moscow itself. They burned it to the ground. Only the Kremlin, protected by stone walls, survived. The rest of the wooden city, rebuilt since the fire of 1547, home to perhaps 100,000 people, became an inferno. Tens of thousands died in the flames, or in the crush of panicked crowds trying to escape through gates too narrow for the flood of refugees. The Tatars withdrew with countless captives destined for slave markets, leaving behind a devastation that dwarfed anything the Oprichniki had inflicted. Ivan had not been in the city. He had fled north at news of the Tatar approach, abandoning his capital to its fate. The Tsar who terrorized his own subjects could not protect them from foreign enemies. The contrast was not lost on observers, Russian or foreign. The following year brought redemption of a sort. When Devlet-Giray returned expecting another easy victory, he encountered a Russian army that had learned from its failures. At the Battle of Molody in 1572, Russian forces, including Oprichniki, fighting alongside regular troops, destroyed the Tatar army in a week of savage combat. Devlet-Giray escaped, but his power was broken. The Crimean threat receded for a generation. Shortly after Molody, Ivan quietly dissolved the Oprichnina. The formal distinction between Oprichnina and Zemshchina territories ended. The Oprichniki were absorbed into the regular service nobility. Even mention of the word Oprichnina was officially discouraged, as if the terror could be erased by refusing to name it. Ivan would continue to execute and confiscate as the mood took him, but the institutionalized apparatus of persecution that had defined the previous 7 years was dismantled. Why he ended it remains unclear. Perhaps the Moscow fire had demonstrated that internal terror weakened rather than strengthened the realm. Perhaps Molody showed that national survival required unity rather than division. Perhaps Ivan had simply killed everyone he wanted to kill, and the machine had served its purpose. The Oprichnina disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind broken families, empty estates, and a traumatized ruling class that would never fully trust any Tsar again. The Livonian War ground on, consuming resources Russia could not spare. What had begun as a confident campaign for Baltic ports had become a quagmire, with Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden joining forces against Russian expansion. Territory that Ivan's armies had conquered in the early years was slipping away, fortress by fortress, town by town. The dream of a window to the west was dying, and with it, the reputation Ivan had built as a conqueror. Ivan increasingly retreated into religion and correspondence, composing lengthy theological treatises, engaging in written debates with foreign rulers, dictating letters that mixed biblical citations with bitter grievances. His mind remained sharp. Visitors noted his intelligence, his memory, his capacity for sophisticated argument, but his grip on reality seemed to fluctuate. He spoke with the dead, saw omens in everyday events, and alternated between grandiose confidence and paralyzing fear. The Tsar who had created terror now lived within it, unable to trust anyone, uncertain whether his own judgment could be relied upon, haunted by the blood he had spilled and the disasters that blood had failed to prevent. Russia was exhausted, and Ivan was not finished breaking it. In 1575, Ivan performed one of the strangest acts of his strange reign. He abdicated. He placed on the throne a Tatar prince named Simeon Bekbulatovich, a converted Christian who had served the Muscovite state loyally for years. Ivan himself took the title of a minor prince, wrote petitions to Tsar Simeon, requesting permission for various acts, and affected the posture of a humble subject before the man he had elevated. The court watched in bewilderment, uncertain whether this was madness, elaborate theatre, or some scheme whose purpose they could not fathom. It was probably all three. Ivan may have been testing his nobles' loyalty, watching to see who transferred their allegiance too quickly to the new Tsar. He may have been attempting to evade prophecies that predicted the Tsar's death that year. If he was no longer Tsar, perhaps he could cheat fate. He may have been indulging the same impulse that had driven his retreat to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda a decade earlier, a compulsion to demonstrate that his power was his to give and take as he pleased. Or he may simply have been losing his grip on reality, his mind fracturing under decades of paranoia and violence. After 11 months, Ivan reclaimed the throne. Simeon Bekbulatovich was rewarded with estates and the title of Grand Prince of Tver, living out his days in comfortable obscurity. The episode left no lasting institutional change, only a deepened sense among the nobility that their Tsar was capable of anything, including acts that served no rational purpose whatsoever. The Russia Ivan ruled was bleeding from wounds he had inflicted. The Oprichnina's purges had killed or displaced thousands of nobles and their retainers. The Novgorod massacre had devastated one of Russia's most productive regions. The Moscow fire of 1571 had destroyed the capital and much of its population. The endless Livonian War drained manpower and treasure year after year, with nothing to show but a lengthening list of defeats. Peasants fled their lands to escape taxation and military conscription, leaving fields untilled and villages empty. The population was declining, the economy contracting, the realm weakening with each passing year. Ivan responded by squeezing harder. Taxes increased. Restrictions on peasant movement tightened, beginning the process that would eventually reduce Russian farmers to serfdom. The burdens fell heaviest on those least able to bear them, while the nobles who might have organized resistance had been too thoroughly terrorized to act. Russia was caught in a spiral of decline, each measure taken to address the crisis making the underlying problems worse. The Tsar's personal life offered no consolation. Anastasia had been dead for 2 decades, and Ivan had gone through wives with a frequency that scandalized even those accustomed to royal excess. Church law permitted 3 marriages. Ivan had at least 7, possibly 8. Some wives were discarded to convents after failing to produce sons. At least one died under circumstances that suggested poison or violence. The later marriages were not even properly recognized by the church, leaving their legitimacy in permanent doubt. Ivan seemed to be searching for something he could not find, a replacement for the stability Anastasia had provided, and destroying each candidate when she failed to deliver it. His sons offered little hope for the dynasty's future. The eldest, also named Ivan, had grown into a capable man of 30, experienced in government and war, ready to take the throne when his father's reign finally ended. The younger son, Fyodor, was simple-minded, more interested in bell-ringing and prayer than in governance, clearly unfit to rule the vast and troubled realm. Everything depended on the Tsarevich Ivan, the only heir capable of continuing what his father had built. In November 1581, that hope was destroyed. The details remain disputed, clouded by rumor and later embellishment. What seems clear is that Ivan quarreled violently with his son. Some accounts say the dispute concerned the Tsarevich's wife. Ivan had attacked her for some perceived immodesty, and his son had intervened. Others suggest political disagreements about the conduct of the Livonian War. Whatever sparked the confrontation, it escalated beyond control. Ivan struck his son with the iron-pointed staff he always carried. The blow landed on the Tsarevich's head. Ivan realized immediately what he had done, falling to his knees, crying out in horror, trying to staunch the blood that poured from his son's wound. Physicians were summoned, but 16th century medicine could not save a man with a fractured skull. For days the Tsarevich lingered, his father never leaving his side, and on November 19th, 1581, he died. The scene would be immortalized 3 centuries later in Ilya Repin's painting. Ivan clutching his dying son, eyes wide with the recognition of what he had done, the face of a man confronting the ultimate consequence of his own violence. The painting captures something essential. This was not an execution ordered in cold blood, not a calculated elimination of a rival, but a moment of uncontrolled rage that destroyed the person Ivan loved most and the future he had spent his life trying to secure. Ivan never recovered. Witnesses described him wandering the palace at night, wailing, calling out his son's name. He increased his already obsessive religious observances, commissioning prayers for the Tsarevich's soul, making donations to monasteries, compiling lists of all those he had killed so that priests could pray for their forgiveness as well. The lists were long, thousands of names, testimony to decades of terror. Ivan seemed to recognize, finally, the weight of blood he had accumulated, and to fear the divine judgment that awaited him. The realm he would leave behind was in no condition to survive without strong leadership. The Livonian War finally ended in 1582, and Russia had lost. Surrendering all the Baltic territories Ivan had spent 25 years trying to conquer. Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden divided the spoils, leaving Russia as isolated from Western Europe as it had been before the war began. The sacrifices had been for nothing. One small consolation emerged from the wreckage. In 1581, a Cossack leader named Yermak had launched an expedition across the Ural Mountains into Siberia, seeking furs and plunder. His small force defeated the Khanate of Sibir, opening the vast eastern territories to Russian expansion. Ivan had not ordered the expedition and played little role in its success, but the conquest that would eventually extend Russia to the Pacific began in the final years of his reign. It was a legacy he had not sought, but would nonetheless claim. The Tsar was 51 years old. He had ruled for nearly 4 decades, longer than any of his predecessors. He had expanded Russia's territory, centralized its government, and established an autocracy that would endure for centuries. He had also drowned his realm in blood, killed his own heir, and left the succession to a son incapable of managing what he would inherit. The end was approaching, and Ivan knew it. His health was failing, his body racked by the accumulated damage of a lifetime of excess and stress. He spent his remaining years in a state suspended between terror and repentance, desperately seeking forgiveness for sins he could not stop committing. The Kremlin, in Ivan's final years, was a place of candles, icons, and whispered prayers. The Tsar's body was failing him. His joints swelled with what was probably arthritis or gout, making movement agonizing. His spine was deteriorating, forcing him to be carried on a litter when he needed to travel. Physicians, including an English doctor sent by Queen Elizabeth I, attended him constantly, prescribing treatments that probably did more harm than good. Mercury compounds, a common remedy of the era, may have poisoned him slowly, even as they promised healing. Modern examination of his remains revealed toxic levels of the metal in his bones. He filled his days with religion. Prayers at dawn, prayers at noon, prayers at night. The offices of the church structured his waking hours as they had at Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, but now without the executions that had punctuated the liturgies. He pored over the lists of his victims, adding names, ensuring that no one he had killed would go uncommemorated. He endowed monasteries to pray for souls he had dispatched, as if sufficient masses could offset the weight of blood. The man who had terrorized a nation was terrified himself, haunted by visions of divine judgment he could not escape. Yet even now, he could not entirely abandon the habits of power. He contemplated new marriages, new alliances, new schemes that might somehow reverse the disasters of his reign. He corresponded with foreign rulers, proposing himself as a suitor for Elizabeth of England, discussing possible asylum in case his enemies finally overwhelmed him. The letters mixed lucidity with paranoia, sophisticated diplomacy with bizarre tangents, revealing a mind still capable of brilliance but no longer reliably in control. On March 18th, 1584, Ivan seemed stronger than he had in months. He took a bath, which eased his aching joints, and called for his chessboard. He was setting up the pieces, preparing for a game with a close attendant, when he suddenly collapsed. Physicians rushed to attend him, but there was nothing to be done. Within hours, even the fourth, Tsar of all Rus, was dead. He was 53 years old. They dressed his body in the robes of a monk, a final gesture toward the religious life he had imitated at Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, but never truly embraced. He was buried in the Archangel Cathedral within the Kremlin walls, alongside his father and grandfather and the son he had killed 3 years before. The dynasty continued, but only in the most technical sense. Fyodor I, Ivan's surviving son, took the throne. He was gentle, pious, and utterly incapable of ruling. Real power passed immediately to a council of nobles, and within that council, one figure quickly emerged as dominant. Boris Godunov, a boyar who had survived the Oprichnina, married his sister to Fyodor, and positioned himself as the indispensable manager of a Tsar who could manage nothing. For 14 years, Godunov governed Russia in Fyodor's name, maintaining stability through competence rather than terror. When Fyodor died childless in 1598, the Rurikid dynasty that had ruled Russia for 7 centuries died with him. Godunov was elected Tsar by an assembly of nobles and clergy, the first ruler who was not a Rurikid, the first whose claim rested on something other than blood. His reign began well enough, but it could not survive the accumulated damage of Ivan's legacy. The time of troubles descended on Russia like a biblical plague. Famine struck first, killing perhaps 1/3 of the population in the early 1600s. Then came pretenders, men claiming to be Dmitri, a younger son of Yvonne who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1591. The first false Dmitri gathered an army, invaded Russia, and actually seized the throne after Godunov's death in 1605. He was murdered within a year, but another false Dmitri appeared, then another. Poland-Lithuania intervened, occupying Moscow itself. Sweden seized territory in the north. Russia dissolved into civil war, foreign invasion, and chaos that seemed to validate every fear Ivan had ever expressed about what would happen if strong authority faltered. The recovery, when it came, vindicated Ivan's methods, even as it repudiated his memory. In 1613, An assembly elected Michael Romanov as Tsar, founding the dynasty that would rule Russia until 1917. The Romanovs restored order through the same tools Ivan had pioneered: centralized autocracy, subordination of the nobility, systematic terror against those who challenged the throne. They built the empire Ivan had envisioned, extending Russian power to the Pacific, the Baltic, and the Black Sea. And they did so while carefully distancing themselves from the Tsar, whose example they followed. Ivan's reputation darkened with the centuries. The epithet Grozny, which in his own time meant something closer to formidable or awe-inspiring, came to be translated as terrible, emphasizing cruelty over power. Historians catalogued his atrocities, psychologists diagnosed his disorders, and moralists held him up as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority. He became a monster in the Russian imagination, the cautionary tale that parents invoked to frighten children. Then came Stalin. The Soviet dictator saw in Ivan not a monster, but a model. Here was a ruler who had crushed the hereditary aristocracy, centralized power in his own hands, and used terror systematically to eliminate opposition. Stalin commissioned films and books that rehabilitated Ivan's reputation, presenting the oprichnina as a necessary response to traitorous nobles, the massacres as regrettable but justified measures against enemies of the state. Ivan became a hero of Soviet propaganda, his methods endorsed by a regime that was applying them on an even larger scale. The rehabilitation was revealing. What made Ivan useful to Stalin was precisely what made him terrible to others: his demonstration that absolute power, wielded without restraint, could reshape a society according to the ruler's will. The question of whether such reshaping was good or evil depended entirely on whether one stood with the ruler or among those being reshaped. Today, Ivan remains contested. Russian nationalists invoke him as the founder of their country's greatness, the Tsar who expanded the realm and established the autocratic tradition that made Russia a great power. Liberal critics see him as the original sin of Russian political culture, the source of a pattern in which strong men rule through fear and citizens submit because they know no alternative. Both sides are right in their way. Ivan created modern Russia, and modern Russia has never escaped the shadow of its creator. The snow still falls on Moscow as it fell 5 centuries ago. The Kremlin walls still rise above the frozen river, sheltering the rulers who succeeded Ivan and the institutions he bequeathed them. St. Basil's Cathedral still lifts its impossible domes toward a grey sky, monument to a conquest that seemed to promise glory and delivered instead decades of blood. The bells still ring, calling the faithful to prayers that have continued without interruption since Ivan knelt in the Dormition Cathedral and rose as Tsar. And somewhere beneath those bells, in a cathedral crowded with the tombs of Tsars, the bones of Ivan IV rest beside those of the son he killed, the father of Russian autocracy, the creator of a system that would govern the largest country on earth for centuries, the man who proved that fear could hold a nation together, and that the one who wielded fear was never free from it himself. He had wanted to be powerful, and he was. He had wanted to be safe, and he never was. He had wanted to be remembered, and he is, but not as he had hoped. The first Tsar of Russia, the terrible, the end.